Hey guys, this is the Ecron Writer here. Welcome you to another OBS project. And this time, I'm going to take it easy for a little while. This time I'm actually going to do a one-shot instead of a series of chapters. And the first one here is a Saving Grace, which is actually one of my other Sleepy Hollow one-shots. I'm sure you guys must be thinking, this has something to do with Grace Dixon, right? Well, sort of. But I should warn you guys, this is probably one of the weakest stories I have ever made. So, let's get this agony out of the way. So we make our way to a Saving Grace. Ichabod stopped by the Sleepy Hollow Cemetery. He went to his late wife's grave to pay his final respects. By the way, this takes place after the Season 2 finale, Tempus Fugit. A few hours ago, she was slewed by him. He had to make an urgent choice. It was either Abbie from Katrina's death spell, or her by his own hands. The lieutenant recently returned from the past and prevented it from being altered by her obsessive, conniving ways of killing Crane, saving her son-to-be, and allying with the horsemen of death. Yeah, she was that much of a backstabber, believe me. Then he had flashbacks of all the horrible things his family did to him, from being the horseman of war to raising Moloch, to ringing the Liberty Bell and creating an army of possessed spellcasters. Then his body began to tense up, and his blood began to boil. He almost felt he was ready to explode. Meanwhile, Gavin was playing Dante's Inferno. He was fighting Cerberus and lost. Oh no! Ugh! I hate getting disemboweled by that damn Cerberus! This is the 9th time this has happened! He plopped on his black futon and sulked a little, until he heard a couple knocks on his door. From the sound of them, he could tell it was urgent. He unlocked and answered it, and Jenny appeared. She looked very worried. Gavin, something happened to Crane. He invited her in, and as they sat, he offered her a drink. Then she explained the phone call she received. She remembered him hyperventilating, and she could barely make out what he was saying, other than he needed Abbie to stop by his cabin. Apparently he wanted to call her, but he accidentally dialed Jenny instead. Then it faded. Jenny immediately called Abbie and told her the news. She said she would stop by. Thankfully, she was off duty, and Frank was doing her shift. This was like a mistake, because, Frank. Little did I know at that time he was going to be in the Witness Protection Program and move out of Sleepy Hollow, along with his family. Maybe he'll work his shift one last time, but he was already committed, so, that was a mistake. Gavin wanted to go to his cabin to check on him, but according to Jenny, Abbie said to stay put, and she would be his private nurse. The hospital would make things worse. All they had to do was wait. When Abbie got there, it was dark, but the door was unlocked. She called him, but there was no response. She hesitantly turned on the nearby lamp on a small wooden stand and saw his body sprawled out on the floor. She looked around and debris was everywhere, like as if a cyclone hit here. At first she thought he was attacked, but on closer observation, she saw his hands were swollen and bruised. She put him on the bed, took off his boots, and covered him with a blanket. His face was pale. He had a cold sweat. His pulse was rapid. His breathing was shallow, and his forehead was burning up. She concluded it was self-infliction. But why? She brought in the first aid kit from her van and took out the thermometer. It read 99.5 and rising. She wondered how she got this way since she didn't see any infections. She then loosened his clothing and laid a wet cloth on his head, but the temperature was still climbing. Then he coughed. She laid her hand on his cheek and begged him to stay with her. Despite the encouragement, his condition was getting worse. His pulse and breathing raced, his temperature kept on rising, and he looked ghastly. She thought about giving him penicillin, but she couldn't give it to an unconscious person. She kept imploring him to hold together, but to no avail. She could definitely tell she was at death's door. She was about to lose hope, but somehow she thought of Grace Dixon. How she used a time reversal spell to get her home moments before Katrina began her wrath. She hurried out and found her journal in the trunk and brought it in. She hoped there would be a spell to cure Ichabod's illness. Sure enough, she found one as she recognized the words. De profundis inferni. Perhaps a demon is responsible? She read it out loud after she removed the damp cloth and laid a hand on his head. And you can read all this if you want. I'll give you the English translated version later. Should be in the author notes, but here it is. She struggled the first time, then tried again, slower and louder. His temperature died down, and she recited her ancestor's incantation one more time. His face changed and returned to its normal hue. Then he took a few deep breaths as his temperature returned to normal. After watching him for a few minutes, she decided to let him sleep. "Thank you," she whispered to her great aunt, and then she called Jenny. Abbie told her that Ichabod has been unresponsive and his cabin was in shambles. Most everything was destroyed, except a few petty furniture. She suspected he'd gotten into deep over his family's betrayals and slipped into a coma. He nearly died, but fortunately Dixon's spell saved him. Gavin suspected he had some kind of mental breakdown, as he had one before, but not to that extent. Jenny confirmed it, although they were both glad that he survived. They agreed they should give him some time to recover before he'd take any visitors. A couple hours later it started to rain, but back at the cabin, most of the debris was removed. Moreover, taken out and tied up hefty bags. Fire was lit and it felt warm and comfortable despite the melancholic weather. Abbie was resting on the side of the Ichabod's bed. It was very tiring in what she had to do. At long last his eyes began to flutter open. His vision was blurry, but he eventually recognized where he was. He gazed at his surroundings and noticed most of his furniture is gone, except the desk at his left where an indigo journal lay flat. Upon the strange markings on the cover, he noticed something very familiar. Then to his right, he saw his best friend, sleeping. "Abbie?" A small grin appeared on his clammy face. Slowly he laid a hand on hers, then she started to stir. When her eyes cleared, his smile returned and whispered, "I knew you'd come. Crane, how are you feeling?" "Much better, Lieutenant. I wouldn't have been here if it hasn't been for you. But while I was in torment, you were there the whole time." Face turned into astonishment. "What does that mean?" "Let me explain." Ichabod remembered when his mind shut down and where he blacked out. Next thing he knew, he was somewhere hot and dark. He felt the intense heat on his face, felt very weak, and while he barely woke up, he saw a flickering light. Flame, he thought. Could he be in hell or purgatory? He heard light footsteps, but he couldn't see who was lifting him by his underarms. He figured there was more than one, and they brought him to some chamber nearby. Then he was laid up against a stone wall and his arms were elongated. They cuffed his hands in shackles, which felt very tight, almost crushing them. Through his sight, he could barely make out the demons that stood before him. However, he managed to make out two of them. Ugh, dang errors. I shouldn't have capitalized that. One had a vehement, hoarse voice. He guessed it belonged to Henry, and another had a feminine cackling voice, perhaps Katrina's. He was horrified as he could hardly see his family metamorphosized as demons plotting their vengeance. He was tortured and beaten. His face was slapped hard, almost as if he was skinned, and another kicked him in the chest. The impact caused him to cough up blood and sputter. That was when Abbie noticed he was taking a turn for the worst. The Legion released and carried him to another room. They tossed him into someplace massive, and the heat was suffocating him. They closed the gigantic iron door behind him, and up ahead there was a fiery pit. The ground gradually shifted him closer, inch by inch. With his strength fading, he knew it was the end for him. He expected his soul to be completely incinerated, lost for eternity. He knew everything he was will be forever gone. Then there was a ray of light descending and shining to where his helpless body lay. The beam blinded him for a moment, and he later ascended. When his eyes adjusted, he could barely see a woman standing, reaching out a hand to him, then felt cooler, and his strength slowly returned. I could have sworn it was you. However, I'm not certain. May have been your ancestor. I do have a strong link between me and my great aunt, mainly by our destiny and our namesake. I guess you could say it was your saving grace. So it could be either way. His face drooped. I can't thank you enough, Lieutenant. Not sure how I can. He stopped him. Don't. You have been through enough. She hesitated and stated she thought she would lose him for good. Thankfully, you didn't. Believe it or not, they suddenly embraced each other. Oh, I thought I had more than that. Anyway, 2 days had passed, and everyone showed up as Frank, Jenny, Gavin, and Turgato discussed about Ichabod's condition and what's next involving the war. However, the Freemason barely spoke. His expression did catch Gavin and Abbie's attention. It was as if he had an ulterior motive, to leave Sleepy Hollow behind. Hence the events of Season 3 and the Lucas legacy. I don't care how disappointed the fans were of the Season 2 finale. I actually was very ecstatic that both Katrina and Henry have passed on. Good riddance. I couldn't resist making an epilogue for the second season. It had to be done since I was very curious of what the aftermath would be, especially for Ichabod. It was very difficult putting a hellish segment in here, as any form of torture could happen. Believe me, I've seen Dante's Inferno. The way I saw it was Ichabod's personal hell. His greatest fears and pain were brought to life as he was struggling from his breakdown and his brain fever. It cannot be reversed, so that's when Dixon came into the big picture. Like that brain fever that killed Katrina's mom in the Paramount movie, Sleepy Hollow. I know Season 3 ruined the series, and I'm reluctant to see the next one set in Washington, but I hope it'll fix everything this show went wrong, which it kind of did, actually. It was a nice comeback. Rest in peace, Abbie Mills. Also, I'm very glad that Molly managed to save Ichabod's imprisoned soul, as she used Abbie's last words. To never give up hope, no matter what. About the spell, I originally written it in English to Latin, but I lost the translation, so I had to do it vice versa. Roughly translated, it goes as follows. Wretched demon, pervading spirit, curse this fallen soul. May God have mercy and shed his grace upon thee. Drag thee out from the depths of hell, profundo infernae. Save you from eternal damnation, restore this fallen one. In case you're wondering what the name Turgato came from, well, that's another story. I'm sure you've already known. It's like Prudence and... It's Turgle and Cato. C-A-D-O. Cato. And it means Great Chief of Pestilence together. So there you have it, guys. And I'm the Ecron Writer, signing out.